I'm a biochemist, and we're going to be talking about women in STEM, so I won't be experts in every field that we talk about, but we are going to venture into the world of STEM and find out where we are with female representation. And we're going to then, besides talk about sort of stats and data, where we are today, we're going to talk about the lives of some really extraordinary women who were in the STEM field and all the things that they went through. And then we'll revisit at the end, how do we work for the future to get more women involved in STEM? And why do we care? Why do we care if women are in STEM? Maybe we're happy with it being such a male-dominated field. But anyway, so let's see, I do have a pointer here. So this shows the latest data I could get, which is 2023, of what percentage of the workers in each of these fields are women. So you see at the top here, the greatest representation is in the field of social science, which is no surprise. You know, social work, psychology, that kind of thing has a good representation of women. 61%, actually the majority of people in that field are women. But then you start getting down here, math, we have 45, and this is tied pretty much with life in the physical sciences, which would be a chemistry field like I am. Then you get to computers here, and not only is it kind of low, but it's been going steadily down. And the combination, engineers are by far the worst. Only 16% of all engineers are female. And then if you take a combination of all the fields together, it's about 26%. And I've been looking into this since at least 2022. It has really not changed much at all in the intervening years. Of course, the data when I was looking at it in 2022 was from 2019. So it really hasn't changed much. And we're going to see in a moment that this number, 26%, is pretty much across the board. This is US data, but other places in the world are seeing the same thing. So I think I have to change the slides up here. So yeah, so about 28% globally of STEM workers are female. So part of the reason for this is it starts pretty young. Males tend to overestimate their skills, and females tend to underestimate their skills. And this was a study from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania that just came out last July. So not only is it hard to get women to go into STEM fields, but once they're there, it's hard to retain them for various reasons. So and they interviewed a lot of women who have been through this process. I'm sure COVID didn't help, because there was a stretch of time when women really took the primary responsibility for taking care of their children at home when they had to be virtually schooled, and trying to keep up with their jobs at the same time was especially difficult. So when it comes to getting promotions, you know, some women aren't that good at self-promotion, not very assertive. And if they do have a negative experience in the workforce, they may quit and either never come back to STEM or never work at all. And these are some of the things that these women said that they encountered. Even once they got into the job, they didn't have opportunities to be promoted. They felt that there was some discrimination against them. They felt somewhat isolated, especially if you are in a field like computer science or engineering. There may not be other females for you to really work together with. And then, of course, there are certain expectations or stereotypes associated with different genders. So this study recommended that employers demystify the process. Some women would apply for jobs and then never understand why they didn't get them. So it would really help if, and if you're applying for a job and 500 other people are applying for the same job, you shouldn't feel too bad if you don't get that job. But a lot of women, and probably people in general, don't get that information, and it would be very helpful so you don't get discouraged. And they just need confidence building exercises or opportunities so that they stay with it. At this point in time, I know in the field of chemistry, more than 50% of all the degrees in chemistry these days are obtained by women. But again, women hit a glass ceiling or they drop out for various reasons. So over the long haul, there's not that many. So this is UNESCO, the United Nations cultural organization, that says that not only is it difficult to get into these fields, and they have some of women experience negative have negative experiences, but they're also more likely than females in other fields, which seems strange, to experience gender-based violence and sexism. And ultimately, the big one, women in STEM get paid less than men. So it's typical across the board for about 20% disparity between men and women in their pay scales. It's not quite as bad as that for women in STEM because STEM does require a lot of education, but it's still above, it's about 15%, or depending on the STEM field, it can be worse than that. So what are the challenges and what have been the challenges? You're going to see examples of this in the women that I talk about today. So education, of course, up till the 20th century, education for females was very difficult to obtain. If they had the opportunity to get education, they often had to stop at a relatively low level of education and move on to other things, or the expectation was that they would get married and raise kids. So it was access to education, and then if you were educated, are you able to, or do you get the opportunity to get a job in the field that you're educated in? Pay disparity, as I already mentioned. What you're going to see today, loud and clear, is credit and recognition, where men took credit for things that women did. Also, of course, then, and this is true across the board for men and women, but can be especially keen for women, which is age discrimination. There's a really good example in the set of people that I have where we'll talk about the impact of age. Racial discrimination, and then you may not think about it much, religious. This is especially during World War II. There was a lot of important, especially physics research going on during World War II, which led to the development of the atom bomb and all kinds of fields associated with nuclear chemistry. And Jewish, if you were a woman and Jewish, it was very, very difficult. So religious discrimination was really rampant in the past. And of course, men experienced that during World War II as well. Okay. Whoops. So I had just the question in my own mind, why? Where did this idea begin with in the first place, that why should women be considered inferior to men? Well, it goes back to Charles Darwin, and you can see this little cartoon up here, which is interesting. This is women, how women think, and this is how men think. But I don't think it's quite that easy. I think both sexes have people that think both of those ways. So some people go back to the Bible and say, well, man was made in God's image, but women were just, taken from Adam's rib. So they're like a step removed. Women need purification. And then just the simple fact of life over time. The human race started out being an agriculture-based society, or they were nomadic. Families raised sheep or other herds that they had to follow around. People had short lifespans. No one had wealth. They were living off the land, subsisting on what they were able to grow or whatever. Men were always the providers, in part because of physical strength and things like that. It was the woman's job to feed the family and to supply the workers, and workers are what was necessary. And then Darwin said that men are more advanced because he had this whole concept of natural selection, and that, the people who develop a certain, not people, or any organism that develops an advantage that allows them to survive better than the rest of the population will go on to procreate more and will become the majority of the population. And men have those advantages and women do not, because they're exposed to other pressures than women. And so you get sort of like a better cut of people because they get a chance, they have other opportunities to whatever, be the strongest, be the best, have the best eyesight, whatever. And women were sort of always in the home raising children, not out exposed to the rest of the world like men were. So, and then there were some other really interesting things too. This is a quote by somebody in the late 1600s. Fluids that women require to perform their primary reproductive function leave their fibers too weak and flaccid to sustain concentrated activity in the brain, thereby precluding women from serious thought and analysis. And he's not the only one who thought that way. So yes, differences in physical characteristics, have often been a point of contention because men are stronger, and so that was their physical strength was taken as an indication of their superiority. Women don't necessarily have, some women are very strong and stronger than some men, but they have endurance, and the fact that they're built for childbearing gives them some advantages too that women don't have. And then there's this thing about IQ versus EQ. So IQ is intelligence quotient and EQ is emotional quotient. So while men tend to excel a little bit more, not to say their IQs are overall higher, they're not, but relative to the things measured on a test like that, facts and all, things related to that is different than having the ability to get along with people, to sense issues, to have more, as it says here, more social awareness and better relationships. And I have had a number of bosses in my work tenure that were women, and were very much appreciated because they had this different idea of how to get along with workers, how to treat people, how to, improve their performance if they did have problems. So that's the emotional quotient part of it that women tend to be a little bit more strong at. So there is still this issue of this disparity. So why hasn't there been more progress in more recent years? Well, we still have stereotypes based on, the supposed masculine versus feminine properties or qualities. And, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy or an unending circle here, lack of role models. So if you don't have women in STEM, it's hard to have role models available to young girls as they make their career choices, to give them the idea that STEM is a good field to go into. So that's going to never end until you get more women there or make them more visible. That's why in ACS, I'm with the Midland section of the American Chemical Society, and I do a lot of STEM outreach, and I think it's really important. One thing we do when we get out, aside from all the science communication and giving kids the opportunities to do hands-on things that make things more memorable to them, they get to see what scientists look like, that we don't look all like Albert Einstein, we don't have thick glasses, we don't walk around with calculators in our pockets all the time. There is no one way that a scientist looks, so people can see that we're just regular folks, and that we're men and women, and that we're old and young, which is good. So in every aspect of life, we have these unconscious biases that we don't even realize that we have, but that they're there, and they can be different for different people, and it's hard to deal with them because, again, the word unconscious indicates you don't know they're there. But there are unconscious biases in hiring. Are you thinking about, should I hire this woman? What if she gets married and decides to take, to leave because she's raising kids? Or, is she going to be available to travel or whatever? And grant funding is important too. Is there some kind of bias? And if you don't fund women scientists or women in the STEM field, then they can't advance. And of course, this whole thing of work-life balance is difficult because women, and women enjoy the fact that they raise their families and want to spend time with their kids. And I know for me, my husband traveled a lot. I couldn't travel because he was traveling. So it's, you have to work those things out. And sometimes the things that you cannot do limit your ability to advance in a particular field. So, and this is, I guess someone's done a study on this. Biologically speaking, men and women have different preferences in life. And men are very taken up and very active and very interested in things where women may be, and this is the difference between the IQ and the EQ again, may be a little bit more interested in people overall. So who cares? Why do we need more women in STEM? As long as we have somebody out there to do the work, why should we care if it's male or female that does that? So again, you can put women in a group just like you can put, black people, African Americans versus, Asian or Indo-Pacific people versus anything else. There are many different groups we can divide ourselves into. And it's just a good idea to have representation from all of them, because then we get diversity of opinion. And the whole thing with STEM is to push toward innovation. And if we want innovation, we have to have new and creative ways of thinking, and the more people we can bring into that discussion, the better. And in general, STEM is an area in the job market that needs people. There's a shortage right now of people in STEM, and the jobs are out there, so we need to fill those jobs to help improve the world economy. And there's somewhat of a moral issue here too, because in middle school, it appears from various studies that kids make a decision, or maybe unconsciously, they start thinking about what they're interested in. And that's why we do a lot of outreach with middle school kids, because they're making decisions about what they think they're interested in and what they might want to go forward to do. And middle school girls are often interested, but for some reason they drop off. And I have some statistics here in just a moment. What happens as you go through high school and then into college, and then somehow that interest wanes. And so it's like, why is that? We need to catch them, we need to nurture those interests and not put up any barriers that makes them feel that they're not free to choose to do what they want. And women do represent over 50% of the population, and some of society's needs are female related. So again, it's good to have that perspective of women in STEM or any other fields for that matter. So we're going to jump right in and start talking about a few women that have some very interesting impacts on the world and some really interesting stories. So how many people in here have ever taken chemistry or did anything like that in school? No? Okay. One of the very famous early chemists, his name is Antoine Lavoisier. So this big slide here is mostly about him, but I have her name at the top there. So he was a Frenchman who lived in the 1700s, and he is very famous for doing all the things that are on this slide. He really discovered oxygen. There were a whole bunch of people trying to understand what's combustion. When you burn stuff, what happens? And people were thinking that if you go back to the days of the Greek philosophers, the only elements they talked about were like fire, water, air, earth. And of course, over time, chemists have found out what makes up all those things, and that now there's 118 elements on the periodic table. So he was the first one that said water is not an element. Water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen. He named those two things. And he found out what was going on in combustion. He also proved that when you start with something and you do a chemical reaction and you end up with something else, if you capture all the matter, whatever form it went to between A and B, and you weigh it or you somehow account for it, you'll find out that you conserve it. Whenever you go from A to B, you measure all the starting materials and all the products, you're conserving mass, which is really an important thing. And he helped with nomenclature too. Overall, he's a stellar example of a chemist in the 1700s. Now here he comes along, and he married his wife Marie when she was 13 years old. He was 40s, I think, or so, but that was like a salvage operation by her father, because a guy in his 50s wanted to marry her, and she did not want that. So he made a deal with Antoine Lavoisier. Do you want to marry her? Because, you know, she doesn't want the 50-year-old guy. And she knew him. She knew Antoine, and she liked the idea, so they got married, but she was only 13 years old. So she was amazing. She was a very intelligent girl for her age, and she knew what he did. He was actually a public administrator. If somebody asked him to fill out a job application, he would have put public service on his application, because he was a tax collector. He and his family paid the French government for the ability to collect taxes. He was also in charge of gunpowder for the French government, and he used some of his chemistry capabilities to improve the quality and quantity of French gunpowder. In fact, Benjamin Franklin came and visited Antoine and Marie during the Revolutionary War to get gunpowder from France for the war. So they had Benjamin Franklin for dinner in the 1700s. So along comes the French Revolution, unfortunately. Here is Antoine Lavoisier, who is this public servant guy, really. In fact, his laboratory, he did chemistry on the side, and his laboratory was in the Arsenal building, the French Arsenal. On the top floor, he had a huge lab there, and they used to invite people over there and just sit and chit-chat about chemistry. Anyway, he got in trouble, so people recognized him as a symbol of the French government, so he got arrested. And he spent a lot of time in prison, and his father-in-law, Marie's father, actually was a tax collector too. Both of them were guillotined during the French Revolution. So here's Marie. She's also in prison for about 2 months or so after he was guillotined. And the French had confiscated all of his chemical papers and notebooks and everything else. I don't know how she did this, but she was able to recover all those notebooks. And for posterity, his papers are at Cornell University, and many of his papers have her handwriting in them. So what did she do? I've talked all this time about how great he was. Well, he was the chemist. She wasn't trained in chemistry, although he had some of his friends teach her basic chemistry, but she was with him in the lab quite a bit of the time. She was fluent in French, Latin, and English. He did not know English at all, and some of the best chemistry papers were written in English. So he relied on her to translate those papers, and she would make notations about what she thought was good or bad chemistry in those papers as she translated them. So she made editorial remarks. She participated in his experiments. She took art lessons, and she drew the apparatus that they built to do the experiments that he did. And here's some of her drawings of some of the things that they made themselves to do his experiments. She took fabulous notes with great detail and recorded all measurements. So his data are, his conclusions are based on quantitative information. So he was a great example of what a chemist should be, and he had a wonderful partner in Marie. So she edited and organized his papers. She ordered all the supplies for the experiments they did, and she held these groups that they called salons in France, where you would gather all the intellectuals of the day, and you would sit and chat or talk about whatever it is. There were art salons where people talked about art. Evidently, they had chemistry salons where she invited people, and they would talk, they would get to know each other, they would discuss problems of the day, et cetera, et cetera. So she was really contributed a lot. Of course, you would never know of her if you just read about what happened in chemistry in the 1700s, but she was really a right-hand helper for Antoine and made sure that his papers survived. If she hadn't been around after his death to try to recover everything, we wouldn't have the ability to know the details of what he did today. Okay, here is a Bay County connection, which is featured in the exhibit out there. So that one of the new exhibits in the main hallway there is our exhibit, the Midland section of the American Chemical Society. And we purposely tried to get some connections to Bay County. The Midland section of ACS covers 5 counties. Since 1945, it's been 5 counties: Midland, Bay, Saginaw, Isabella, Gratiot. I don't know. And so what am I missing? I think I got them all. As of January 1st next year, we get 16 additional counties, and we're going to go to the top of the northern part of the Lower Peninsula. Rachel Holloway Lloyd, she is a wonderful story. So she was born, I think, in Ohio, and she was essentially orphaned by age 12. And she was sent to a school. And then, you know, she took the only job that women could have in those days. You were either married and raised kids, or you were a teacher. That's what you could do. And so she did teach at some all-girls boarding schools, no co-ed schools at this time, unless you maybe had a one-room schoolhouse, and that was what was available. This is in the 1840s, 50s time frame. So she did get married at age 20 to Franklin Lloyd, and by 26 she was living in Bangor Township here in Michigan. Her husband was a chemist, and he came from Philadelphia, where they were living at the time, moved out here, and he was working for a company. I can't remember the name of the company right now, but they were barrel makers. They had salt business, and I think it was lumber that he was involved in too. Strange for a chemist. He wasn't really doing chemistry. He was teaching her at their home, and he had a little lab at their house, and he was teaching her chemistry. And by the time they arrived in Bangor Township, she had already lost one of her children in infancy. She had another while she was here, but that child died also in infancy. And Franklin this was considered the rugged frontier, but people in Philadelphia were like aghast. You're going to Michigan? What is there? It's, you know, forest, and, you know, it's wild out in Michigan. And really, there was very few churches. There probably were very few doctors. It was considered a rugged life. So they moved here. She had a second child, as I said, who also died in infancy. Her husband got ill. He had bilious fever, and he died at the age of 34 here in Bay City. Now, they did a lot to improve the lives of the people who worked for her husband, Franklin. And they lived in a one-room house that was the office of the business as well as the place where they lived. But they set up Sunday school, they started a church while they were here, and they were really well beloved while they were here. And there is a very detailed description of their life here a little bit, and how all the town gathered when Franklin died, and they were going back to Philadelphia with his coffin, how everybody gathered and was very sad that he was going, because he was viewed as a very good boss. So what to do? You've lost your husband, you've lost 2 children, you're all by yourself, and you're back in Philadelphia. Well, she had some money from the closure of the business and everything, so she did travel abroad. She also had some medical problems at that time, so she traveled abroad. And when she came back, she taught chemistry for the first time. Girls didn't have access to labs or any science at that time, but she is believed to be the first person who actually taught in a girls' school that taught the girls chemistry. Then, with some of her money that she had left before the big panic after the Civil War, she took classes at Harvard in the summertime, specifically in botany. This is the only way a woman could attend Harvard at the time, because they weren't allowed to go there and get a degree. So she took summer school, 7 summers out of 9. There was some time she took off there. And with the guy who ran the program, she was able to publish 3 papers in a highly reputable chemistry journal. And she was the first woman to do that. She, with all of her experience after this time at Harvard, where she met a couple of other very important chemists that we'll talk about later, she tried to get into Bryn Mawr. Now, Bryn Mawr is an all-woman school. They refused her at Bryn Mawr to get into the program to get a degree because she didn't even have a high school diploma at this point. But she was more educated than probably most of the other people that applied there. But she was refused by them, and she didn't know what to do. She wanted to increase her own education, but she didn't have any good opportunities. So believe it or not, one school in the whole world where a woman could get a PhD in chemistry, and that was at Zurich Polytechnic in Switzerland, and you had to speak German. So she learned to speak German, and she went to Zurich, and in 2 years she got a PhD in chemistry. She's the first American woman to get a PhD in chemistry, and she was 48 years old when she completed that. So, and she's only the second person in the world to get, second woman in the world to get a PhD in chemistry. So she came back, and a guy that she met during her summers at Harvard kept track of her. And when she finished her PhD, he asked her to come to Nebraska. He was at the University of Nebraska. And they were setting up a sugar program there. And in 1887, and it was co-ed there. A big deal. She went out there in 1887. She was associate professor. And she was the only person on the staff with a PhD, and she was a woman. And she started out as an associate professor, rapidly advanced to professor, and in past 1888, for a while there, she was department chair. So she was the first woman to be the chair of a chemistry department. But interestingly enough, she studied sugar beets. So she was out there, and she and this fellow who hired her, I think his name was Hudson Nicholson, he had this idea that Nebraska was the perfect place to grow sugar beets. So, and she had some experience with sugar beets when she was in Europe. They grew them over there. So she and he did a bunch of studies on sugar beets and tried to find out what seeds were the best, what soil conditions were the best. They analyzed the sugar in the beets that were grown to pick the ones to go forward with, et cetera. This took a number of years, and she was dealing with farmers. So there's also an elaborate description of a meeting she had with farmers. So the farmers come in to hear about, what they should do for their sugar beets, and there's this woman talking to them in the front of the room. But she very rapidly convinced them that she knew what she was talking about. And in 5 years, because she was only at the university for 7 years, because she had some health issues, again, the production in Nebraska increased 11-fold over that time. And they established a sugar beet processing factory there. In fact, one of the ones around Lincoln is still in operation that was started during the time that she was there. So she really did, and she was very well loved by her students. She recruited more women into the chemistry department, and they just recently discovered a time capsule that they didn't even know was there, that was put there by some of her students that had some really interesting things about her in there. But she had a stroke, and she died in 1900. She was only 60 years old. She went back to Philadelphia as her health started to fail. But she worked for various churches, taught Sunday school, would go into the bad parts of town to help people who were disadvantaged. After she was partially paralyzed and had other health problems, she couldn't do anything else. So she at least did that, what she could. So the American Chemical Society was actually started by a woman named Rachel, but not this Rachel, but someone that she also went to the botany program with. And that Rachel resigned from ACS because all the rest of it was, in fact, next year is the 150th anniversary of the American Chemical Society. But the first Rachel dropped out because the men were so nasty in ACS. They were constantly criticizing women, and at the meetings they would talk negatively. Some women weren't even allowed to attend the meetings. So she quit, but Rachel then became the first active woman in ACS. And after that, some of her students joined too. So, and the University of Nebraska got a special designation from ACS in 2014 as a National Historical Chemical Landmark. And actually Midland has 3 National Historical Chemical Landmarks for important events or people that are related to chemistry that have happened here. So wonderful. If you there's some films out there, some YouTube videos, and a memorial written by her brother-in-law that are just just glowing with praise about what a wonderful person she was. So switching from Rachel, this is Alice Ball, and her field was pharmaceutical chemistry. So 1892, she's crossing over with Rachel a little bit, but you can see there, she died very, very young. So she was born in Seattle, and her family was a bunch of photographers, so she was around chemicals all of her life. In fact, her grandfather was a Civil War photographer who took a lot of pictures of Frederick Douglass and other people during the Civil War. She was African American. They moved to Hawaii for her grandfather's health, and she eventually went back to Seattle after he passed away. And then she got 2 degrees from the University of Washington in 4 years. That's pretty amazing. And published a paper in the Journal of the American Chemical Society, which is still like the premier journal in chemistry. So after those degrees, she went back to the University of Hawaii and was the first African American there. And she got a master's, which was the only thing that she could get there. At the University of Hawaii in chemistry. Now, this chalmugra oil is an interesting story. So Hawaii had a huge, and people have probably heard of this, a huge leper colony. And they sent everyone to the island of Molokai who had leprosy. And I don't know why the incidence of leprosy was so high there, but this was a miserable situation. These people were sent to this island. They had to live there. They weren't allowed to leave, and their children were taken from them. So they had to live there, and leprosy is a horrible disease. The official name of it is Hansen's disease. So they suffer numbness, they suffer deformities in their limbs, they can go blind, they have nerve damage that can affect the eye. And the only treatments available at the time, and I don't know what the original situation was with this, but there's this tree called the chalmugra tree, and up there you see what must be the fruit, and inside the seeds. And people had discovered somehow that those seeds had an oil in it that would help. But the only way that they had of delivering that was to rub it on the skin as a salve. And they tried giving it orally, they tried injecting it, and it was very, very painful. The treatment was painful. The salve, if you rubbed it on your skin, could make your sores even worse than they already were. So it did help a little bit, but it was not ideal. And someone who was a surgeon that was associated with the leper colony asked her if she would study this chalmugra seed situation, see if she could come up with a better treatment. So that's what she did. She separated out the contents of what was in the seed oil, and there were things called fatty acids, which you've probably heard of with regard to nutrition and things. She chemically modified them to make them water soluble. So that made it much more easy to inject. And this was the treatment for leprosy until the 1940s when antibiotics were discovered. So, and the gentleman, the doctor, I think his name was Holloman, who asked her to do this, said that 84 people were released from the leper colony after being treated with her. That was the first set of people. But over time, it's hard to believe, they had people in exile on this island not permitted to leave for over 100 years. 1866 to 1969. And so they finally started letting people off the island if they were treated with this, and they improved. And then they found that there is a bacteria that has to do with this disease, and when they first started developing sulfa drugs in the 1940s, they had an alternative treatment to doing this. Now, she died at age 24, and evidently she was doing a lab. She was, because as a student, she probably taught labs, and she's thought to have inhaled chlorine gas. She got sick, she went back to the US for treatment, but she passed away. And she hadn't published her results yet. So guess what? The president of the College of Hawaii, and I spelled that wrong, or typed it wrong, took credit for her work and published it as his own, along with a professor from the chemistry department, and called the method that she had used to purify the materials to become injectable the Dean method, because his name was Dean. Well, remember that surgeon that was associated with the colony, the leper colony, Holloman, right there, Henry Holloman, he said, no, this is not correct. It should be called the Ball method. He published a paper talking about her work, but it was published in a kind of obscure journal, so not that many people paid attention to it. But it took till the 1970s for two professors at the University of Hawaii to look up her original work and finally give her credit for the work, for what she had done when she was at the University of Hawaii. But, okay, Lise Meitner, she's a very interesting person. Okay, so as is typical, so she was born in Vienna, Austria, and her dad was very educated. I think he taught at the university, and women, of course, were not allowed to attend the university. No surprise. I think she sat in his lectures was all that she could do. And she took courses to teach French because, again, that was the only thing available. Teach something. So she learned French so she could teach it. And then at age 19, the laws changed in Austria, and they decided they would allow some women to attend the university, but you had to pass a test. And of course, she's had nothing in she's had no high school training. She's had very little education, but she started to cram. For 2 years, she crammed to study for this test, and she's one of 4 women who passed the test to get into the university. So she began to go there, and she was interested in physics. So she ended up with a PhD in physics in 1905, the second German woman to get one, and then she went to a different university and started working with a gentleman named Otto Hahn. Now, at this university, it was awful. The women, she was not allowed in the chemistry building initially at all, and if she wanted to go to the bathroom, she had to walk down the street to a hotel to go to the bathroom because she wasn't allowed in the building. They did not pay her. So her parents gave her a small stipend, but she was doing chemistry and physics, which she loved, so she wanted to keep on doing it. She lived on tea and toast for a number of years. Finally, there was the guy who ran it, whose name is Emil Fischer, who you guys won't recognize, but he was a famous chemist. He finally decided, well, maybe he thought that women shouldn't be in the lab because their hair was a fire hazard. But finally he decided, okay, we'll let women in the building, but we won't let women in the labs. So she had to work in the basement of the building. And again, no pay for some period of time. So World War I came along, and so you'll find out later, I'm going to spend some time on Marie Curie. How can you give a talk about women in STEM and not talk about Marie Curie? But Marie and Lise were sort of opposite each other. So here's Lise, and she was living in Austria, which was fighting a war, World War I, against the French and Americans. So Marie Curie was helping the French during World War I, and Lise was helping the Germans and the Austrians, and they were both doing similar things. Marie Curie had found radium and X-rays, had studied X-rays, so she had put together this army of vehicles that carried around essentially X-ray machines, if you can imagine these, in 1917. Very primitive and leaky as heck with regard to the radiation. Anyway, it was a way to go around the battlefield and find people with wounds, X-ray their limbs to find out where the bullets were, so you just don't start cutting somewhere before you know where you need to cut. And Lise was doing something very similar on the German side. So she was in the field as an X-ray technician until 1916 or so, when the progress of the war made it such that they felt they didn't need her anymore. So she went back to the lab, and she did start to get some credit for things and became, and started to, there had been various discoveries of these new elements because of the studies of X-rays and radiation, et cetera. And she was trying to identify this isotope for element 91. And Hahn, the guy that she worked with in the lab, they got along really well, but he's really a character. So he went away to fight in World War I, and she was left in the lab by herself and made a lot of progress, and they were communicating and everything. But while he was away, she really did all the work to identify this isotope. When he came back, he got an award for it. even though he really hadn't been there to do any of the work. I think his name was on a paper. See, that was the problem. So if you do the work, you write the paper, but if your name isn't on the paper, you don't get any credit either. And then based on what's on papers, or what's in your bio or whatever, you might get nominated for an award, but his name is on the paper, so he gets the award. So finally in 1922, she was the head of the physics department at Wilhelm University, and she gave the first public lecture there by a woman, and she had discovered what is called the Auger effect. She had actually discovered it before the guy named Auger discovered it, but he got his name on now they're sort of trying to coach people to call it the Auger-Meitner effect. It's kind of too late in the game. Now people are used to it. And that has something to do with electron decay in the atom. All this physics stuff gets very complicated very fast. Okay, so here she is. She's Jewish by birth, although she's a Protestant by practice. And she's living in Germany. Hitler comes to power in 1933 and immediately wants to fire all Jewish professors, and starting with women. And she figures, I'm okay, I am a practicing Protestant, I haven't been a practicing Jew for a long, long time. Besides that, I'm an Austrian citizen. Remember, she was born in Vienna. I'm okay for the time being. But then Hitler invaded Austria in 1938 and took over Austria, and she starts to get really worried, and everyone around her starts to get really worried for her welfare. So they sneak her out and get her across the border in Sweden. Hahn, again, who's just up and down and all around, gave her some diamonds to put in her pocket that were his mother's in case she had to bribe a guard to get across the border. But she makes it across the border into Sweden and was kind of lost because, of course, she didn't know anybody there. She wanted a job. She wanted to do physics, but sort of, you know, didn't know what to do for a while. So she was kind of like in exile in Sweden. And now Hahn's back in the lab, and he's doing a bunch of experiments that he can't explain. So he's sending her letters telling her what he's getting and saying, you know, I don't really understand what this is. So she started discussing the results with her nephew, who is also a physicist. And the two of them came up with this idea of nuclear fission, that you can take the nucleus of an atom and you can bombard it with particles called neutrons and make that nucleus split into two. So you start with a heavy element that's got a lot of protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and you end up with these lighter elements, which nobody really understood was going on at the time, and they called it nuclear fission. Of course, this is the basis of the atomic bomb. And she wanted nothing to do with the atomic bomb because she had seen World War I, the effects of war in World War I, and she, of course, was a victim herself of what was happening in World War II, and she refused to work on the atomic. And of course, the Americans and the Germans were in this mad race to see who was going to develop the first atomic bomb. But anyway, so in 1944, a Nobel Prize was awarded for figuring out nuclear fission. Who do you think got the Nobel Prize in 1944? It was Otto Hahn that got the Nobel Prize, and she was left completely off of the Nobel Prize in chemistry of that year. So she spent the rest of her life in Sweden, and she was still practicing and trying to recruit women into physics and all that. She was very did a lot of work after that. And finally, in 1992, she got some credit because they named a new atomic element for her, meitnerium, which is number 109. So we're getting up closer and closer to the 118 that we have on the periodic table right now. But she would have dinner with Hahn. She was just a very mild-mannered. There was nothing she could do about her situation. So she accepted it, and she went to the Nobel dinner where he got the award and sat at the table with him and never caused a ruckus or anything about the fact that she didn't get the credit that she deserved. But everybody else got upset about it. So Grace Hopper, here we talk about age. Grace Hopper. So she's an American, and no particular scientific background or anything, but, and she married relatively young, although that didn't last, but she ended up with a PhD in Yale in math. She went to Vassar first and got a degree in Vassar, which was an all-women's school, and got this degree at Yale in 1934. So when World War II broke out, she wanted to volunteer in the waves. So let's see, that was Women something Volunteer Emergency Services. But they said, you're too old. So she was born in 1906. She was too old. They said, you're too old and you're too little. We don't really want you in the waves. But she would not let this go. She was very tenacious. They finally said, okay, Grace, we'll take you. So she joined the waves, and they gave her this project working with people at Harvard on the very first computer called the Mark I. And this computer was 50 feet long and weighed 35 tons. So this was the early days of computing, very large, bulky, slow compared to today computers, but the very first one. And they used that computer to make various calculations that were beneficial in World War II, including calculating rocket trajectories and making calculations relative to the blast with regard to the atomic bomb. So it was very useful during World War II. Well, after that, she went to the Mark II and the Mark III projects, so she was very involved in the first computers. I don't understand this very well. I'm not a computer scientist, but she invented something called a compiler, which had to do with communicating with the computers in terms of developing code. The code was very had all kinds of symbols and things in it. She wanted it to be to make it easier for the programmers to communicate with the computers. So in 1952, she invented this thing called a compiler. And then she said, I want people to be able to talk in English or pick a language, in normal languages to computers. So to be able to give commands and stuff. So she developed COBOL, which is Common Business-Oriented Language, and that's still used today. COBOL is still a computer language used today. So it does allow you to write a computer program in English that computers can understand. So she kept on working with computers, educating people, training. At one point in time, the Navy asked her she asked over the years, can I please get out of the waves? I'd really like to join the full Navy. They said, no, you can't do that. Again, too old, too small, we're not going to let you in. They forced her to retire in 1966 because they said she was past the age limit, but then Vietnam broke out. And they called her back. And they said, okay, Grace, we're going to let you join the Navy, the real Navy. So she came back for Vietnam and stayed the whole rest of the time and progressed up through the ranks in the Navy. The Navy asked her to standardize all the computer languages that were being used in the Navy, which she did. And again, she traveled around, she wrote about computing, the use of computers. She actually came up with the term debugging. One of the computers had a problem. She actually found a bug inside the computer. They took it out and they fixed it, and she said, we just debugged the computer, which she did. So a trainer, she really thought computers had a future. That they were too bulky and she was trying to make things easier because she saw a day when if computers became more friendly, that they would have a tremendous utility in all parts of life. She finally retired in 1986, almost just short of her 80th birthday in the Navy. By that time, she was a rear admiral in the Navy. So she is actually, this is a link. Oh, so 40 honorary degrees, Distinguished Service Medal, Presidential Medal of Freedom. What more can you ask? And she was on David Letterman. If you go to this link, you can see this interview between David Letterman and her. She was a real character. But again, everyone enjoyed working her. She knew her stuff, and she made a tremendous impact, even though she did have her struggles. Trying to make her way through. So this is an Asian contribution here. Chen Shuing Wu, who was born in China, and again, who did not have much access to early education. Her father actually founded a school for girls so she could go to school. And that school still exists, and her ashes are buried at that school. But she left China to get, she went as far as she could, but to get an advanced degree, she had to leave the country, and she came to the US. She was really sort of looking around for schools to go to. She actually thought about U of M. But there was too much discrimination against women on that campus. You couldn't even get into the union if you were a woman. So she said, no, thank you. She ended up at UC Berkeley, where they were more liberal, and she stayed there for a while. She was in Princeton during World War II, and she couldn't get back to China because of there was a war that China and Japan fought, and then there was the Chinese Revolution, and so she tried to maintain contact with her family, but she never really went back and saw. Most of her family had passed away by the time she actually got back to China. But she was in Princeton teaching servicemen for a while during World War II. She had trouble getting a job because she was Asian and she was a woman, and there was a lot of competition. She couldn't really get a job. But she did work for the Manhattan Project. She isolated the isotopes that were important in that, and she studied this thing called beta decay, which is where atoms have, either too many protons in the nucleus or too many neutrons in the nucleus, and so to get some sort of stability, they have to let go of one or the other. And she was really the world's expert on that. She proved a number of people's theorems. She was an experimental physicist. Are there any fans of the Big Bang Theory in this room, or am I the only one? Okay, the only physics, well, I took physics in school, but the only physics I really know is what I learned on the Big Bang Theory. But so she actually, and they talk about Feynman and all these people on the Big Bang Theory, but she was an experimental physicist, so you always had this battle between Sheldon and Leonard about experimental physics versus theoretical physics, but she believed in the experiment. You can sit down and think about all this stuff and come up with these ideas, but I'm going in the lab to do some experiments to prove what people thought. So she excelled at this. They said, if she does your experiment, you know it's going to be done right. And these weren't easy experiments. She was using radioactive materials and designing her own equipment. But she did do this experiment that threw out the law of conservation of parity, which is like this huge thing that's the basis of physics at the time. And for that, she did the experiment, but the two gentlemen who had the idea, probably the theoretical physicist, who came to her and asked her to do the experiment, and she figured out all the ways to do it to show whether it was true or not, they won the Nobel Prize in 1957. And again, she was not mentioned. She was the first person, she did all this work at Columbia University. She finally found a home there where she was able to get a position and continue on. So she stayed at Columbia for the rest of her career. And she did become the first tenured physics professor at the university in 1952. So again, another theorem related to beta decay in 1963. 20 nominations for a Nobel Prize, never got one between 1958 and 1973. But she did get the National Medal of Science and was the first female president of the American Physical Society. She, again, highly respected, and she did have one son who also became a physicist. And I love this quote: "There's only one thing worse than coming home from the lab to a sink full of dirty dishes, and that is not going to the lab at all." So the lab gives you a little bit of a perk there when you enjoy that work so much. She actually is one of the few, I don't know if she's the only one. And Grace Hopper, by the way, had a military destroyer named for her. That this woman had an asteroid named for her while she was still alive, which was considered to be a huge deal. Okay, this is a person from Midland who is one of our national historical landmarks. And she was the first female black chemist, PhD chemist to work in industry. And she got a job at Dow. So, you know, it's hard, she's more recent, and it's hard to know a lot of detail about her life. She only lived to age 60. But she, of course, was brought up in the South, so she went to a lot of segregated schools and married a Tuskegee airman who was an electrical engineer. And she had 3 kids of her own. One of her kids is a physicist. And so she started working at Dow in 1965 and worked on Saran. And she also worked on latex emulsions for paint and paper-related coatings. And she does have 3 patents to her name. But one can just imagine life in Midland at this point in time. Midland has never been a highly integrated city anyway. But the first African Americans to come to Midland were around 1863. And the jobs, really the only jobs they could get were as barbers for some reason. One guy tried to get a job in a lumber mill and they wouldn't hire him. And after the first couple moved on or passed away, believe it or not, between 1943 and the early 60s, there were no African Americans in Midland. There were laws against black people renting or owning houses in Midland. So Lynn Dorman, who by the way just passed away at age 90, he was an amazing chemist, and he just passed away, came in about 1961. So he was probably the first one. And at that time the census says, you know, maybe a dozen people or so. And then Leroy Hampton, who had a lot of administrative and other jobs. He was more on the business side, came in the mid-60s. So she came with her husband. So this life could not have been very easy for these people. I'm not sure what the housing situation was at that point in time, but there was only a few of them, and I'm sure they felt very isolated, and some people were not kind. Their kids got teased in school, and it was not easy. But she did do well in her job at Dow and has a number of patents, as I said, and she passed away at age 60. But now they have commemorated the fact that she worked there with a National Historical Chemical Landmark. And she graduated from Wayne State University, had her PhD in physical chemistry from Wayne State University. So they also lay claim to Betty Washington Greene. So this is Marie Curie. Finally, we're nearing the end. We're going to end on the high note. And everything is on one slide, which is kind of hard to believe, but Marie Curie. So she was born in Poland in 1867, I believe, and her nickname was Mania. She was from a good-sized family. I think she might have been the youngest child. And her parents believed in education. Her mom died of typhoid when she was relatively young. But her sister wanted to go to medical school, and as far as, I'm not sure what the boys in the family did, but they had a lot more opportunity. Her sister wanted to be a doctor, and so the family was really oriented trying to find a way to get her through medical school. And Marie wanted advanced education too, but she had to help earn money to pay for her sister Branya to go to France to medical school. So she took a number of jobs as a governess as she was growing up so that her sister could, in fact, and she did, go to medical school and become a doctor. So she finally, after her sister was settled and married, she actually got the opportunity then to go to France. And Poland was actually governed by Russia at this time when she was young, and the Polish hated the Russians. And they were spied on all the time, et cetera, et cetera. She loved her homeland, but she was very happy to get away and go to France. And she started with a deficit of knowledge. She wanted to get into the Sorbonne, which is a very famous university in Paris, but she really lacked credentials. So again, lots of cramming, lots of studying, trying to qualify, got in, qualified for math and for chemistry, and got into the university. She met her husband, Pierre, and he was older than she was, but they immediately struck it off. They ended up getting married, and he was studying the effect of temperature on magnetism. He also studied this thing called the piezoelectric effect, which is when you push on some crystals, you get them to emit electric current, if you can believe it, the piezoelectric effect. So he did, and he actually became the chair of the department while she was there, but she got a job in one of the laboratories. And then this is right around the time at the end of the 19th century where people had discovered X-rays. They didn't know what they were. And of course, when you think about all these experiments and people dealing with radioactivity, they had no idea about how dangerous radioactivity could be. Safety, they didn't even wear safety glasses or gloves or anything, and they were dealing with all these radioactive materials, especially what Marie ended up, some of the things that she dealt with were really highly radioactive. So she started working. Becquerel had discovered X-rays, and she decided to do that for her thesis. And Pierre eventually gave up his work to work with her because he thought she was, some of the things that she was doing were very groundbreaking. So she asked for a special area to work on this material, and they had a big heap of this stuff called pitchblende available for their research, which was a byproduct of some kind of mining, and it was highly radioactive. Nobody really knew what was in it, but it was more radioactive than even uranium. So she got that. She got some stuff delivered to this special shed that she was working in, and she and Pierre worked out there, and they tried to purify materials out of this pitchblende, find out why it was so radioactive. They actually discovered 2 new elements on the periodic table. One was they named polonium in honor of Poland. The other one was called radium, just for ray, and she said that radioactivity was an inherent property of an atom. It was an atomic property. It wasn't something that came from somewhere else. It was the atom itself and its structure that made it to be radioactive. And this was this was a bolt of lightning in the chemical community at the time. And Pierre had all these fancy instruments that he had worked out, so she modified them. They worked together, and just after she got her PhD in chemistry, she found out they won the Nobel Prize. So she is the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. She and her husband got the Nobel Prize in 1903 for the discovery of radium. And it was actually radium chloride that they purified. So in this shed, that took them 4 years. They went through 400 tons of pitchblende and 40 tons of aqueous material to do extractions. They came up with 0.1 grams of radium chloride. And so for that, they won the Nobel Prize. And they were both starting to feel the effects of working on radioactivity at that point in time. They thought, wow, this stuff is so cool. Radium glows in the dark. Marie slept with a little vial of radium next to her on the bedside. I mean, nowadays, her cookbooks are in a lead-lined container that she used at home because everything they dealt with was radioactive. They're probably in lead-lined coffins because they did move their bodies to the French Pantheon. She was the first woman, which is this huge building to honor, people in France that have been truly outstanding. But everything they touched was radioactive. So she purified the radium. They got the Nobel Prize. They were actually too ill to attend the ceremony from various effects. I mean, they did all kinds of stuff. Pierre actually put a piece of radium against his skin on purpose and kept it there for a week to see what it would do. And of course, it caused a burn. And they started to think, oh, okay, this stuff is corrosive with tissue. So could it be used to treat cancer? We know that it will, kill cells. Maybe it can be used for a therapeutic purpose. And so they did start to investigate that. And the world found out about radium. And you had radium in your toothpaste. and all these cures for everything that had radium associated with them. And maybe you heard of the women called the radium girls that used to lick their paintbrushes and paint radium dials on watches so that they glowed in the dark. So over time, radium seeks bone. It likes to displace calcium in the bone. Over time, their jaws deteriorated, their teeth fell out, and there was a huge lawsuit filed by some of the women against the manufacturer. But if you can imagine sitting all day, I can't remember how many watches they went through in a day, but they were painting the numbers on the dials, and they would lick to the paintbrushes that had the radium on them to get them to a fine point so that they could put the numbers on the dials. So they found out that it did really have some deleterious effects. So she started to get these prizes. Okay, both of them had the Nobel Prize. Both of them won the Stevie Medal. In April of 1906, Pierre is killed in an accident in Paris. He's run over by a military cart in the streets of Paris. So he died suddenly. Marie was totally devastated. And she had 2 young children by this time. So she did what she could, and she continued to work. Work was probably her salvation. And then she had an interest in one of Pierre's students named Paul Langevin. So he was also a very remarkable physicist at the University of Sorbonne. And ironically, when Pierre died, the people at the university asked Marie if she wanted his position. So she actually took the chair of the physics department, which was her husband's appointment, only because he died. So she was the first woman to have that job, and they have a photograph of her giving her first lecture there right after he passed away. So anyway, she took up with his student, Paul Langevin, who was a married man, and they did, whatever they were, They wrote letters back and forth to each other all the time, dangerous. His wife found some of the letters, and then she sent some of them to a newspaper, and all kinds of stuff got published, and so her name was dragged through the mud. She was a foreigner. She was a Polish person living in France, and these foreigners are dragging us down. And Paul actually fought a duel. There were a number of duels over this whole relationship because she found out she got a Nobel Prize in physics this time in 1911 by herself. And then people have said, oh my God, she can't go to the Nobel ceremony. She's got all the scandal all over her. She can't go and sit in this room full of dignitaries, including the King of Sweden. Nobody's going to want to sit with her. She really shouldn't go. She went. And she sat at the table with King Gustav of Sweden, and nobody cared. But anyway, she got the Nobel, and she's the only person who has won 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different fields. And very few women. Some people have won, and her family, we're going to go through her family altogether has 5 Nobel Prizes. Anyway, so eventually they broke up, and Marie was a very good friend of Einstein. There's pictures of them together. And Einstein knew some of this too. I mean, he had an illegitimate child. He had a relationship with his cousin. He has all kinds of things in his background too, so he could relate. But eventually Paul, and after all the scandal and everything, Paul and Marie didn't see each other anymore. But interestingly enough, as it says down there, their grandchildren got married. His grandchildren and her grandchildren, one of them got married. So she got the Nobel Prize. She started 2 different institutes based on the study of radioisotopes. She came to the US twice and got money. They raised money here in the US for her to buy some radium, because you can imagine it was difficult to purify, very expensive, but they raised like $50,000. This is in 1920 or whatever. She came to the US, she went to the Grand Canyon, she got to meet the president. She thoroughly enjoyed her time. She must have been able to speak English, although I didn't really see any place where that was. And then she came back another time, and people raised more money because she had 2 institutes dedicated to the study of radiation therapy and to radioisotopes in general. One was the Radium Institute, which only lasted as long as she lived, and the other one is the Curie Institute, which is still going. And she was on the World War I battlefield, as I mentioned, with her daughter. Her older daughter, Irene, became a physicist, and Irene and her husband won a Nobel Prize. They were studying the bombardment of various atoms and and coined this term artificial radioactivity. They could start with a normal atom and make it radioactive by bombarding it with neutrons. So she and her husband shared a Nobel Prize also in the 30s. Marie did not live to see her daughter get the Nobel Prize, but she was aware of the research that she was doing because she passed away finally in 1934, as you would imagine, from secondary effects due to all of her work with radiation. But she lived a fairly long life considering all the exposure that she had. It was anemia that she finally, pernicious anemia, that she finally passed away from. But okay, so she had two children, Irene. Irene got a Nobel Prize with her husband, and then her other daughter was highly accomplished as well. She was a musician. She was a writer. She was the secretary. She worked for the Secretary General of the United Nations at one point, and then she ended up marrying John R. Lebois, who was an American diplomat. At different times, he was ambassador to France, ambassador to Greece, and he ran UNICEF at the United Nations for some long period of time, like 15 years or something. He got a Nobel Peace Prize for his work with UNICEF, and she was there at his side as well during that time working with him. They got a Nobel Peace Prize in 1965 for their work with the United Nations. And her daughter, also right there in that picture, also became a physicist. So there's a pattern here too. Not only did these women excel in their pursuits of their various scientific pursuits, but they also raised their children well. Their children often took after them and went into science as well. And so you see various pictures of all the people involved there, and a picture of Marie in her laboratory. But an amazing, amazing story. Okay, so how do we get more women to go into STEM? And here is just an interesting statistic. In middle school, and I mentioned this is kind of a crucial time, the 2 times as many boys as girls indicate that they want to go into STEM in middle school. By college, so at high school, it's even a more of a disparity, and by college it's worse. And for computer science, which is the worst, that was the lowest line on the first graph I showed you, 5 to 1 boys to girls interested in going into computer science by the time they hit college. So what is happening over this time frame? Well, it's really important for all children at home to have supportive families. But if you talk to children about what they want to do, try to be neutral or try to aim them toward careers where they're going to be self-supporting and that they're going to contribute. But at school, sometimes what teachers do has a lot of influence on the kids. The way that they gesture, their tones, the way they look at the children, in a negative way if they don't answer correctly or if they are doing something they shouldn't do, and just the way they handle children should be even across the for boys and girls. There's sometimes a situation where the boys will get more computer time, so they want to make sure girls have equal access to computers, that they want them to learn in groups. So it's great to mix the groups, that's good. Or maybe it's appropriate sometimes to have girls working together in groups. Engagement and coaching is really important. So, outside of school time, it's important to get after-school activities that also encourage them or give them examples of what they can look forward to if they do go into STEM, and transportation to events. And this role model thing again, be able to see what female scientists look like, and that it's accessible, that it's not somebody, maybe rich and famous, or somebody who lives in somebody not like me. That it's important for them to see someone that looks like themselves who has done that. And so Eleanor Roosevelt said, well-behaved women rarely make history. And I say maybe, because look at the women that we talked about today. Despite all of their obstacles, they still had a tremendous impact, even if it wasn't recognized at the time they made it. And so they were so amazingly patient. I wouldn't have lasted under those conditions, but they were courageous, they were persistent, and their stories, even their stories beyond their contributions are instructive. And the best thing that we can do to honor their achievements is to encourage women to take up STEM and to make sure that in general, we just make it attractive for boys and girls to go into STEM fields, because we need people to work in STEM across the board. But we honor them by trying to remove some of the barriers remaining to equality in the STEM fields. So that's probably pretty much my last slide.